In the heart of Manhattan's financial district, on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning, chaos erupted inside First National Bank. Armed robbers stormed through the glass doors, weapons drawn, transforming the marble lobby into a war zone. Among the terrified hostages was Serafina Miles, the 34-year-old CEO of a billion-dollar investment firm. Now, with a knife pressed against her throat, outside, 4 police officers mocked a single father who dared to ask permission to enter and help. They thought Arthur Kane was just another fool with a death wish, but within minutes, as this unassuming mechanic systematically neutralized each armed criminal with lethal precision, everyone would discover the truth that changed everything. He wasn't just a concerned citizen. He was a former Navy SEAL. Arthur Kane stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, his broad shoulders slightly hunched from years of bending over car engines in his auto repair shop. At 36 years old, his dark brown hair had begun showing threads of silver at the temples, premature aging from the weight of loss he carried. His deep blue eyes held a perpetual sadness that only lifted when he looked at his 7-year-old daughter, Evelyn. She was his entire world now, the sole reason he woke up each morning and pushed through another day of grinding work in Queens. The calloused hands that once wielded military-grade weapons now spent their days covered in motor oil, fixing broken transmissions and worn brake pads for customers who barely knew his name. 5 years had passed since cancer stole his wife, Rebecca, leaving Arthur to navigate single parenthood alone. The transition from elite military operative to civilian mechanic hadn't been his choice but a necessity. Rebecca's lengthy battle with lymphoma had drained their savings, forcing Arthur to leave the SEALs and take any job that offered stable hours and health insurance. The prestigious medals and commendations from his service in Afghanistan and Iraq now sat buried in a shoebox beneath his bed, relics of a life he rarely spoke about. Even Evelyn didn't know the full extent of her father's military past. To her, Daddy was simply the man who made the best pancakes on Sunday mornings and read her bedtime stories about brave princesses who saved kingdoms. That morning had started like any other. Arthur had braided Evelyn's golden hair into her favorite style, a simple ponytail with a blue ribbon that matched her school uniform. They'd eaten breakfast together at their small kitchen table, scrambled eggs and toast, while she chattered about her upcoming science project on ocean animals. The irony wasn't lost on Arthur that his daughter, who'd never seen him in uniform, had inherited his fascination with the sea. After dropping her at St. Mary's Elementary School, he'd driven to First National Bank to deposit the month's earnings from his shop, a modest sum that would cover rent and groceries with little left over. The bank's interior gleamed with prosperity Arthur would never touch. Marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers, and mahogany desks housed financial advisors in $1,000 suits. He felt out of place in his worn jeans and faded flannel shirt, clutching a wrinkled deposit slip like a lifeline. The teller line moved slowly, giving him time to observe the morning crowd of investment bankers, trust fund beneficiaries, and corporate executives conducting their business with practiced efficiency. Serafina Miles entered the bank at 9:15 sharp, her presence commanding immediate attention. Her tailored red power suit cost more than Arthur made in 3 months, and her blonde hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders. As CEO of Sterling Capital Management, she'd built her reputation on calculated risks and iron-willed negotiations, but beneath the polished exterior lay a woman who understood struggle intimately. She'd grown up in foster care, clawed her way through Columbia on scholarships, and never forgot those who'd helped her along the way. 5 years ago, her charitable foundation had covered Rebecca Kane's experimental treatment costs when insurance refused. Though the treatment ultimately failed, Serafina's generosity had given the Kane family 6 precious additional months together. Arthur recognized her immediately, though they'd never formally met. He'd seen her photograph in the thank you letter from her foundation, memorized the signature at the bottom of the check that had bought his wife more time. Watching her stride across the bank lobby with confident purpose, he felt a familiar tightness in his chest, gratitude mixed with the phantom pain of loss. She was there to finalize a $50 million acquisition, a deal that would expand her company's reach into international markets. Neither of them could have predicted how violently their paths would intersect in the next few moments. The first gunshot shattered the morning calm at 9:23. The bank's heavy glass doors burst open as 4 masked men rushed inside, assault rifles raised, voices bellowing commands that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Customers screamed, dropping to the floor in waves of panic as the lead robber, a tall, gaunt man with cold gray eyes visible through his ski mask, fired another warning shot into the ornate ceiling. Plaster rained down like snow, coating the terrified hostages in white dust. Zane Porter had planned this heist for 6 months, studying the bank's routines, identifying security weaknesses, recruiting his crew with promises of easy millions. At 40 years old, he'd spent half his life in and out of federal prison, each stint hardening him further, until violence became his first language. His accomplices, George Miller, Carter Blake, and Otis Reed, were younger men hungry for quick wealth, willing to follow Zane's lead into the depths of criminality. They moved with rehearsed precision. George covering the main entrance, Carter controlling the teller area, and Otis sweeping through the offices, forcing everyone into the central lobby. Arthur dropped to the floor with practiced fluidity, his body automatically assuming a tactical position that allowed him to observe while appearing compliant. Old instincts awakened, dormant neural pathways firing with remembered training. He counted the threats, noted their weapons, calculated distances and angles of attack. The familiar weight of adrenaline flooded his system, but he remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled, his expression neutral. Around him, civilians sobbed and whimpered, their fear palpable in the recycled air. Serafina had been mid-signature when chaos erupted. The acquisition documents scattered across the conference table as her business partners dove for cover. She'd started to follow when Otis Reed grabbed her arm, yanking her upright with enough force to tear her blazer's shoulder seam. His eyes, bloodshot and wild behind the mask, recognized opportunity when he saw it. The red suit, the designer jewelry, the air of authority that clung to her like expensive perfume. Everything marked her as valuable. Zane noticed his subordinate's discovery immediately. Crossing the lobby in 3 quick strides, he studied Serafina with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey. Recognition dawned slowly, his thin lips curling into a smile beneath the mask. He knew exactly who she was, had seen her face on Forbes magazine covers and CNN financial segments. A CEO worth hundreds of millions would make the perfect bargaining chip. The knife appeared in Zane's hand with practiced ease, a 6-inch tactical blade that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He positioned himself behind Serafina, one arm wrapped around her waist, the blade pressed against the delicate skin of her throat. She stood rigid, her green eyes wide but alert, calculating her own odds of survival. The cold steel against her carotid artery left no room for heroics. One wrong move would paint the marble floor crimson. Outside, the NYPD response was swift and overwhelming. Squad cars formed a barricade around the bank's entrance, their sirens creating a symphony of urgency that drew crowds of onlookers. 4 officers took point positions behind their vehicles, weapons drawn, radios crackling with updates from dispatch. Clinton Hayes, Finn Douglas, Ronnie Clark, and Leo Turner were young cops, none older than 28, eager to prove themselves in what could become a career-defining incident. Arthur watched through the bank's floor-to-ceiling windows as the police established their perimeter. He recognized their body language, the mixture of excitement and fear that marked inexperienced officers facing their first major crisis. When Zane dragged Serafina to the center of the lobby, using her as a human shield while shouting demands, Arthur made his decision. Rising slowly from his position among the hostages, he moved toward the entrance with deliberate calm. George Miller swung his rifle toward the movement, finger tensing on the trigger. Arthur raised his hands, voice steady and unthreatening. He explained he was leaving to speak with police, to serve as a messenger for the robbers' demands. Zane, focused on controlling Serafina and negotiating with law enforcement through the bank's phone system, barely glanced at what appeared to be another terrified civilian fleeing danger. George, after a moment's hesitation, let him pass. The late morning sun felt surreal after the tension inside. Arthur approached the police line with his hands visible, immediately identifying himself as a hostage who'd been released to communicate demands. The 4 officers surrounded him quickly, their questions rapid-fire and overlapping. He answered calmly, providing detailed intelligence about the number of robbers, their weapons, the hostage count, and most importantly, the CEO being used as a human shield. Clinton Hayes, the senior officer among the 4, stood 5 feet 10 inches with the build of a former high school quarterback gone slightly soft. His pale blue eyes held the arrogance of someone who'd never faced real danger, whose understanding of violence came from training videos and shooting range targets. When Arthur suggested he could return inside and potentially neutralize the threat, Clinton's laugh was sharp and dismissive. The mockery came swift and cruel. Finn Douglas, red-haired and freckled, pointed out Arthur's oil-stained hands and shabby clothes, wondering aloud if he thought this was some action movie where mechanics became heroes. Ronnie Clark, the youngest at 25, suggested Arthur should focus on fixing cars and raising his kid, rather than playing soldier. Leo Turner, thin and nervous, added that single fathers who got themselves killed left orphans, asking if Arthur had even considered what would happen to his daughter. Arthur absorbed their contempt without reaction, his expression remaining neutral, while his mind processed tactical solutions. He understood their perspective, saw himself through their eyes as a delusional civilian with delusions of grandeur. They couldn't see the years of training compressed into muscle memory, the dozens of successful operations in hostile territory, the precision violence he'd wielded in service to his country. To them, he was just another working-class nobody trying to insert himself into a situation beyond his comprehension. Inside the bank, Zane's demands escalated. $5 million in unmarked bills, a helicopter to the airport, a fueled private jet to Mexico. The negotiations followed predictable patterns, but Arthur noticed subtle changes in the robber's behavior through the windows. George had moved away from his assigned position, drawn toward the teller area where Carter was stuffing cash into duffel bags. Otis paced nervously near the offices, his attention fragmenting as stress mounted. These were cracks in their discipline, opportunities for someone trained to exploit them. When Arthur insisted one final time that he could help, Clinton Hayes grabbed his shoulder roughly, spinning him toward a patrol car. The order was clear to leave before they arrested him for interference. But as Clinton's hand made contact, Arthur's body responded with trained reflexes held in check only by conscious will. The officer never knew how close he'd come to being dropped by a man who'd once eliminated a Taliban cell commander in hand-to-hand combat. The situation inside deteriorated rapidly. Zane's paranoia, fueled by cocaine he'd snorted in the bathroom to maintain his edge, transformed into explosive violence. He struck one elderly hostage, who'd started hyperventilating, the crack of his pistol against the man's skull audible even outside. Serafina tried to intervene, her CEO instincts to protect others overriding self-preservation. Zane's response was to press the knife harder against her throat, drawing a thin line of blood that trickled onto her white silk blouse. Arthur saw the blood through the window and felt something primitive awaken in his chest. The memory of Rebecca in her hospital bed, pale and fragile, merged with the image of Serafina in danger. This woman had given his family hope when medicine failed, had shown kindness to strangers when she had no obligation to care. The debt he owed couldn't be measured in dollars, only in action. The police might mock him, the world might judge him foolish, but Arthur Kane had never walked away from duty. He entered through the bank's side entrance, a service door the robbers hadn't bothered to secure. The employee who'd propped it open for a cigarette break had fled, leaving Arthur an unguarded access point. He moved through the back corridors with silent efficiency, his worn work boots somehow soundless on the polished floors. Every corner was checked, every doorway assessed, his progression methodical and patient. The building's layout unfolded in his mind like a tactical map, each room catalogued for threats and advantages. George Miller never heard him coming. The robber stood alone near the vault entrance, his attention fixed on Carter's progress with the cash. Arthur approached from behind, measuring each step, controlling his breathing to match George's rhythm. The takedown was textbook special operations, a rear naked choke applied with precise pressure that cut blood flow to the brain without crushing the windpipe. George went limp in 8 seconds, unconscious but alive. Arthur lowered him silently to the floor, zip-tying his wrists and ankles with restraints he'd noticed on a security desk. The rifle George had carried was an AR-15 knockoff, poorly maintained but functional. Arthur checked the chamber, noted the full magazine, and slung it across his back. He preferred to work without firearms when possible, but options were always valuable. Moving deeper into the bank, he heard Carter Blake cursing at a stubborn cash drawer, completely absorbed in his greed. The younger robber, 26 years old with a history of armed robbery, had tunnel vision that would prove fatal to his criminal career. Arthur struck with the rifle's stock, a measured blow to the base of Carter's skull that dropped him instantly. Another set of zip ties secured the second threat, leaving only Otis and Zane to handle. The math was improving, but the most dangerous elements remained. Zane still held Serafina hostage in the main lobby, and Otis prowled somewhere in the administrative offices. Arthur needed to isolate them, prevent any coordination that might result in dead hostages. He found Otis first, the 30-year-old Detroit native standing guard, over a group of bank employees huddled in a conference room. Through the door's narrow window, Arthur observed his target's positioning, noted the Glock pistol held loosely in his right hand, the way his left hand kept touching his mask, as if the fabric irritated him. Sweat had soaked through Otis's black shirt. Stress manifesting in physical discomfort that distracted from vigilance. The flashbang substitute was improvised but effective. Arthur had noticed the bank's emergency strobe lights during his initial reconnaissance. Devices designed to alert hearing-impaired customers during fire alarms, triggering the system in just the conference room section, created a disorienting barrage of white light that sent Otis spinning in confusion. Arthur entered during the chaos, closing distance before the robber could orient himself. The disarmament was swift, the Glock stripped away and skittering across the floor. Otis tried to fight, throwing wild haymakers that Arthur slipped with minimal movement before delivering a precise strike to the solar plexus that folded him in half. A follow-up knee strike to the temple ended the confrontation. 3 down, 1 remaining. But Zane Porter was the most dangerous. A career criminal with nothing to lose, and a hostage he'd shown willingness to harm. Arthur could hear him screaming in the main lobby, his voice cracking with amphetamine-fueled rage as he demanded to know where his crew had gone. The police outside had noticed the lack of movement from the other robbers, their confusion evident in the increased radio chatter Arthur could hear through the bank's thin walls. Serafina's voice cut through Zane's ravings, calm and controlled despite her circumstance. She was trying to reason with him, using negotiation tactics from boardroom battles to buy time. Arthur recognized the intelligence in her approach, the way she humanized herself by mentioning her own difficult childhood, creating cognitive dissonance in Zane's mind between seeing her as a symbol of wealth and recognizing her as a person who'd also struggled. Arthur entered the main lobby from the upper mezzanine level, moving along the balcony that overlooked the main floor. The hostages below spotted him first, their eyes widening in recognition of the mechanic who'd left earlier. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling silence. And remarkably, they obeyed. Perhaps they sensed something different about him now, the way he moved with predatory grace, the rifle held with professional familiarity. Zane stood with his back to the teller windows. Serafina pressed against him, the knife still at her throat. His free hand held a 9mm pistol that swayed between pointing at hostages and aiming at the entrance where police might breach. His mask had been pulled up to his forehead, revealing a gaunt face marked by prison tattoos and meth-scarred skin. His gray eyes darted constantly, paranoid and dangerous. The distance from the mezzanine to Zane's position was approximately 30 feet, with a 15-foot vertical drop. Arthur calculated trajectories and impact forces with the same part of his brain that had once computed sniper shots in Afghan mountain ranges. The rifle would be too cumbersome for what he planned. Setting it aside silently, he prepared for an approach that would have seemed impossible to the mocking officers outside. He vaulted the mezzanine railing in one fluid motion, dropping toward Zane with controlled precision. The robber heard the movement, started to turn, but Arthur's descent was already committed. He landed behind Zane, absorbing the impact through bent knees, while simultaneously sweeping the knife hand away from Serafina's throat. The blade clattered across marble as Arthur's momentum carried all 3 of them to the ground. Zane Porter fought with the viciousness of a cornered animal. His pistol swung toward Arthur's head, but the former SEAL had already trapped the arm, using Zane's own elbow as a fulcrum to break his grip. The gun discharged once, the bullet striking a chandelier and sending crystal shards raining down. Hostages screamed and scattered, but Arthur remained focused on controlling the threat. His training took over completely, muscle memory guiding him through a sequence of strikes and joint manipulations that systematically destroyed Zane's ability to fight. The confrontation lasted 43 seconds but felt like hours to those watching. Zane tried to bite, to claw, to headbutt. Every dirty trick learned in prison yards and street fights. Arthur countered each attempt with clinical efficiency, never using more force than necessary, but never hesitating to inflict the pain required for compliance. When Zane finally went limp, unconscious from a blood choke that mirrored the one used on George, Arthur maintained the hold for an extra 3 seconds to ensure he wouldn't immediately revive. Serafina had rolled away during the struggle, her hand pressed to the shallow cut on her throat. She stared at Arthur with a mixture of shock and growing recognition, not of his face, which she'd never seen before, but of his capability. The way he'd moved, the precision of violence wielded with surgical control, spoke of training far beyond any civilian self-defense course. Her green eyes searched his blue ones, looking for answers to questions she hadn't yet formed. Outside, the four officers watched the confrontation through the bank's windows with mounting disbelief. Clinton Hayes's arrogant smirk had vanished, replaced by slack-jawed astonishment. Finn Douglas kept blinking as if trying to clear his vision, unable to reconcile the oil-stained mechanic they'd mocked with the professional operator who'd just neutralized four armed criminals. Ronnie Clark's hand had unconsciously moved to his own weapon, recognizing in Arthur's movements a level of combat proficiency that exceeded anything in police training. Leo Turner was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper that carried profound respect and shame. "That man's a Navy SEAL. Has to be. Nobody else moves like that." The words hung in the air as SWAT vehicles arrived, black-clad tactical officers pouring from armored trucks with rehearsed precision. They breached the bank's entrance, expecting resistance, but found only Arthur Kane standing calmly in the center of the lobby, hands raised and visible, surrounded by unharmed hostages and unconscious criminals. The scene was so unexpected that the SWAT team leader, a veteran with 15 years of experience, stopped dead in his tracks. Arthur's identification of himself was professional and precise. Former Navy SEAL, Team 3, recently separated, had neutralized all four threats with non-lethal force. He provided his service number, his former commanding officer's name, details that could be quickly verified. The SWAT leader, himself a former Marine, recognized the bearing of a special operations veteran and ordered his team to secure the criminals while treating Arthur with the respect his service demanded. The aftermath unfolded in waves of controlled chaos. Paramedics flooded in to treat minor injuries among the hostages, though miraculously, no one had been seriously hurt except for the elderly man Zane had pistol-whipped, who suffered a mild concussion. The four robbers were loaded into separate ambulances under heavy guard, all expected to survive and face federal charges that would likely result in decades of imprisonment. Serafina refused medical treatment for her throat wound, insisting it was superficial. Instead, she pushed through the crowd of first responders to reach Arthur, who was giving his statement to a detective. She waited until there was a break in the questioning, then stepped forward with the composed determination that had built her empire. But when she spoke, her voice carried an emotion that subordinates and rivals had never heard from the legendary CEO. "You saved my life," she said, her fingers unconsciously touching the bandage a paramedic had insisted on applying. "5 years ago, I tried to save your wife's life. I failed. But today, you succeeded where I couldn't. You gave me what I couldn't give you. Time." Arthur's composure, maintained through combat and questioning, finally cracked. His eyes glistened with unshed tears as the weight of her words settled over him. He thought of Rebecca, of the extra months Serafina's charity had provided, of bedtime stories and birthday celebrations that wouldn't have existed without this woman's kindness. The circle of debt and gratitude had closed in the most unexpected way. The media arrived like locusts, news vans disgorging reporters and camera crews who'd been monitoring police scanners. The story was irresistible for 24-hour news cycles hungry for heroes. A working-class single father, a Navy SEAL who'd given up his career to care for his dying wife, had single-handedly stopped a bank robbery and saved one of New York's most successful CEOs. The narrative wrote itself, complete with redemption arcs and American dream symbolism, but Arthur wanted none of it. When reporters thrust microphones at him, he repeated the same phrase with quiet firmness. He'd done what needed to be done. Nothing more. He had a daughter to pick up from school, a shop to run, bills to pay. The ordinary concerns of his life hadn't changed because he'd briefly returned to his former profession. He was still just a mechanic from Queens trying to raise his little girl right. The four officers who'd mocked him stood in a cluster near their patrol cars, unable to meet his eyes when he walked past. Clinton Hayes started to speak, perhaps to apologize. But Arthur continued, without acknowledgement. He had no anger toward them, only a weary understanding that judgment came easy to those who'd never been tested. Their shame would be punishment enough. A lesson in humility that might someday save lives when they learned to look beyond surface appearances. Evelyn was waiting at the school's aftercare program when Arthur arrived, painting a picture of dolphins that she proudly displayed for his approval. She chattered about her day as he signed her out, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded while she learned multiplication tables and practiced cursive writing. Arthur held her hand tighter than usual as they walked to his truck, a battered Ford that had seen better decades but still ran reliably. The drive home was interrupted by Arthur's phone ringing constantly. Unknown numbers he ignored with practiced indifference. News of the robbery had spread across social media faster than wildfire. Cell phone videos from hostages creating viral content that would dominate feeds for days. Arthur Kane's name trended nationally, then globally, as time zones awakened to the story of the humble hero who'd emerged from obscurity to save the day. 3 days later, Serafina Miles stood outside Arthur's auto repair shop in Queens, her presence as incongruous as a diamond in a coal mine. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, an attempt at casual dress that still looked expensive on her elegant frame. The shop was closed, Sunday being Arthur's only day off, but she could hear voices from the apartment above where the Kane family lived. She climbed the narrow stairs and knocked. Waited. Knocked again. Arthur answered, wearing a flour-dusted apron, Evelyn peeking out from behind his legs with curious eyes. The smell of baking cookies wafted through the doorway, chocolate chip from the scent, probably made from scratch given the flour on Arthur's hands. The domestic scene was so different from the violence of their last encounter that Serafina had to recalibrate her prepared speech. The conversation that followed was careful, both adults aware of the child listening with the intense focus children employed when they sensed important adult matters being discussed. Serafina explained she'd come to thank him properly, away from cameras and police statements. She mentioned a trust fund she wanted to establish for Evelyn's education, a small gesture compared to what Arthur had done. She spoke of debt and gratitude, of circles closing and new chapters beginning. Arthur's refusal was gentle, but firm. They needed nothing from her. No reward for doing what conscience demanded. But Evelyn, bold with childhood innocence, piped up with a request that surprised both adults. She wanted to see Miss Serafina's office, the tall building she'd seen on television, maybe learn about business and math and the things that made companies work. Her father fixed cars, but maybe she could fix companies someday, help people like Miss Serafina did. The simplicity of the child's ambition, untainted by class consciousness or social barriers, broke through the awkwardness. Serafina laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her face from corporate armor to human warmth. She agreed immediately, suggesting next Saturday for a tour. Perhaps lunch afterward at a restaurant that served the best chocolate cake in Manhattan. Evelyn's squeal of delight settled the matter before Arthur could object. Over the following weeks, Saturday visits became routine. Serafina would arrive at the shop in increasingly casual clothes, though she never quite mastered the art of looking ordinary. She taught Evelyn about spreadsheets and profit margins with the same patience Arthur showed, teaching her to change oil and check tire pressure. The unlikely friendship that developed seemed to surprise no one more than the participants themselves. Arthur discovered that beneath Serafina's CEO exterior lay a woman who'd never had a real family, whose drive for success had been fueled by the fear of returning to poverty. She learned that his silence didn't indicate simplicity but rather a depth of thought that expressed itself through action rather than words. They were opposite in so many ways, yet united by an understanding of loss and the determination to build something meaningful from life's wreckage. The moment things shifted from friendship to something more was subtle, almost imperceptible. It happened during Evelyn's school play, where she played a dolphin in an ocean conservation story. Arthur and Serafina sat together in the auditorium's uncomfortable plastic chairs, watching the 7-year-old deliver her lines with theatrical seriousness. When Evelyn spotted them in the audience and waved enthusiastically, breaking character completely, they both laughed and waved back, their hands accidentally touching in the gesture. Neither pulled away. The contact was brief, fingers brushing, but it carried an electric recognition of possibility. They were still looking at each other when Evelyn's teacher gently redirected the girls' attention back to the play. In that moment, surrounded by other parents and the chaos of elementary school theater, something fundamental shifted between them. The CEO and the mechanic became simply Serafina and Arthur, two people who'd found each other through the most unlikely circumstances. The first real date came a month later. Dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Arthur's neighborhood. Rather than any of the Michelin-starred establishments Serafina frequented, she arrived by subway rather than her usual town car, having learned that Arthur valued authenticity over impression. They talked until the restaurant closed, the owner finally intervening with gentle humor about other customers he'd like to serve someday. They discussed everything and nothing, the conversation flowing with surprising ease. Serafina shared stories from boardrooms that were as foreign to Arthur as his tales from Afghanistan were to her. Yet beneath the surface differences, They discovered shared values about loyalty, dedication, and the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Both had been shaped by loss into people who understood life's fragility and the preciousness of unexpected second chances. The relationship that developed was complicated by their different worlds. Serafina's colleagues couldn't understand her attraction to a blue-collar single father. Arthur's customers at the shop made jokes about him dating above his pay grade, though never mean-spiritedly, and never to his face after seeing his quiet intensity. The media, when they inevitably discovered the connection, painted it as a fairy tale, the hero's reward for his bravery. But for Arthur, Serafina, and Evelyn, it was simpler and more complex than any outside narrative could capture. It was three people building something together from the scattered pieces of their separate lives. It was learning to trust after loss, to hope after disappointment, to believe that happiness wasn't just something that happened to other people. It was Evelyn having someone to talk to about girl things that mystified her father, Arthur finding a partner who understood ambition even if expressed differently, and Serafina discovering that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. 6 months after the bank robbery, they stood together at the site of a new charitable foundation Serafina was launching. One focused on supporting veterans, transitioning to civilian life. Arthur had resisted being the face of the organization, but Serafina convinced him that his story could help others who'd struggled with the same challenges. The 4 police officers who'd mocked him that day were in attendance, having become unexpected advocates for the program after their humbling experience. Clinton Hayes approached during the reception, his swagger replaced by genuine humility. He apologized formally, acknowledging that his prejudice could have cost lives if Arthur had listened to his dismissal. The apology was accepted with the same quiet grace Arthur brought to everything, no grudges held, the past left where it belonged. The officer would later become one of the foundation's most active supporters, using his story of misjudgment as a teaching tool for police academy recruits. As the sun set over Manhattan that evening, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Arthur stood with Serafina and Evelyn on the building's rooftop garden. The city sprawled beneath them, millions of lives intersecting in patterns too complex to predict. Somewhere in those streets was the bank where violence had brought them together, now repaired and operational, its marble floors showing no trace of that terrifying morning. Evelyn ran ahead to explore the garden, her laughter carrying on the wind as she discovered a small pond with koi fish. Arthur and Serafina watched her, hands intertwined, comfortable in their silence. They'd both learned that love could arrive in the most unexpected ways, that strength wasn't always visible on the surface, and that sometimes the best things in life came from the worst moments. The future stretched before them, uncertain as all futures are, but no longer faced alone. Arthur would continue running his shop, finding dignity in honest work, teaching his daughter the value of service and sacrifice. Serafina would build her empire higher, but now with someone to remind her that success without connection was just elaborate loneliness. Together, they would create something neither could have imagined when they woke up that ordinary Tuesday morning that had become anything but ordinary. In the end, the story that began with mockery and violence had transformed into something else entirely. It became a testament to the unexpected ways lives intersect, the debts that bind strangers into family, and the courage required not just to face armed criminals, but to open hearts scarred by loss to the possibility of love again. As night fell over New York City, Arthur Kane, former Navy SEAL, current mechanic, and future husband, held his family close and knew that sometimes the greatest missions were the ones you never saw coming.